They laughed at her limp, spat at her boots, and cursed her name. But when she passed the quiet rancher sitting in the corner, nobody knew the frontier was about to remember this night forever. The town of Dry Creek squatted low against the desert plain, its wooden buildings leaning as if the sun itself weighed them down. Dust curled like smoke with every gust of wind, coating the storefronts in a pale, unshakable film. Horses clopped slow along the street, their riders glancing toward the sheriff's office that loomed with its single-barred window and faded sign, the law's symbol in a place where law felt more rumor than fact. Across from that building stood the Red Lantern Saloon, lantern light already spilling from its swinging doors, though the day had not yet given way to night. The saloon's piano clinked a tune that was less melody than noise, masking the arguments and drunken laughter inside. Yet above it all, the sheriff's star was meant to shine. Sheriff Harlan wore it heavy on his chest, strutting like the desert rooster he fancied himself. Clara May limped into that world like a wound made flesh. She carried herself upright, shoulders squared, but the uneven rhythm of her steps betrayed the scar left behind years ago. Her husband had been buried long since, and the town, never kind, found her limp an endless invitation for ridicule. The Tucker gang had taken her life apart in one night of fire and gunpowder, but the sheriff called it unfortunate business and bid her move on. Still, she came back, again and again, hoping someone in Dry Creek might hear her voice. Today she had gone into the sheriff's office, hands trembling not from fear but from rage controlled. She asked for justice, for the Tucker gang's raids to be stopped, for the burning of ranches and the theft of cattle to mean something more than an inconvenience. Sheriff Harlan leaned back at his chair, boots crossed on the desk, and laughed through his thick mustache. He told her she was wasting his time. He told her the limp made her look pitiful. He told her no jury would ever side with her against men who drank with half the town. When she left, the Tucker boys lounged on the porch rail, spurs clinking. They called her Cripple May, voices sharp as spurs digging into flesh. One spat tobacco juice close to her skirts, forcing her to step wide, her gait thrown more awkward than before. Laughter followed her down the steps like chains clattering. On the other side of the street, under the angled shadow of the general store's awning, sat Elias Boone. He occupied the same chair every afternoon, hat low over his brow, eyes half hidden, a man carved out of the desert's patience. The town knew him only as the quiet rancher who rarely spoke, who never raised his voice, who worked his land at the edge of Dry Creek and came in only for salt, flour, and the occasional barrel of nails. Clara limped past him without slowing, the sheriff's insults still ringing. Dust swirled at her heels, the sun sinking just enough to paint the horizon in molten orange. Boone did not rise, did not speak, did not even turn his head fully, but something in the stillness of him carried weight. His silence was not weakness. It was the sound before thunder. Children peered from doorways, their mothers whispering. "Poor Clara May," one said, shaking her head. "She'll never learn. Sheriff won't lift a finger for her. Best keep her mouth shut." Another muttered, "Boone could have stood up once, just once, but he never does." Yet no one dared say it loud enough for him to hear. Inside the saloon, men watched through the cracked shutters. They knew the Tucker gang had grown bold, that Sheriff Harlan's purse was heavy from their bribes, and that Dry Creek was slowly surrendering itself. But still they sat with their whiskey, pretending blindness was safer than truth. Clara made her way down the street, her limp more pronounced with each step, and every eye followed. The whispers carried pieces of her story. How the Tuckers killed her husband by nightfall fire. How she had thrown herself in front of her children to save them. How the limp came from a bullet meant for her spine. Few believed all of it, but they believed enough to shun her. People feared tragedy like it was contagious. Sheriff Harlan stepped from his office, stretching as if tired for mockery. He lit a cigar and smiled toward Boone across the street. "You'd think she'd give up," he said loud enough for the whole street to hear. "But some cripples don't know when to crawl home." Laughter rose again, carried by the Tucker boys like a chorus of jackals. Boone did not laugh. His head remained bowed, hat shadowing his eyes. One of the Tucker boys spat near his boots. The rancher neither moved nor flinched, and that unsettled them more than if he had stood. They shifted in their seats, pretending it hadn't mattered. The town watched the exchange, though it was no exchange at all. A woman humiliated, a sheriff corrupted, a gang emboldened, and a rancher silent. Yet in that silence, the air grew heavier, as though the desert itself were waiting. By sundown Clara had retreated to her cabin on the outskirts, the road long and uneven. She closed the door behind her and leaned against it, her hand pressed to her chest. The insult of the sheriff cut deeper than the laughter of the gang. She had expected cruelty from them. But law was supposed to mean something. Tears came, unwanted, hot against her cheeks. She bit her lip until the taste of iron met her tongue, refusing to cry where her children could see. Back in town, Boone remained seated until the street emptied. The lanterns of the saloon flickered against his weathered face as he finally stood, joints stiff from hours of stillness. He lifted his gaze toward the sheriff's office, where shadows moved behind the curtains. His eyes, when the hat no longer hid them, burned like banked coals stirred by a sudden wind. For a moment, the quiet rancher seemed less rancher than something older, more dangerous, like a story the desert itself had swallowed but not forgotten. The Tucker boys returned to their horses, laughing low, yet every so often one would glance toward Boone's chair and shiver without knowing why. Sheriff Harlan barked at them to mount up, to ride, to keep their business hidden under the desert's cloak of night. They obeyed, but the bravado in their voices cracked at the edges. Boone had not spoken, yet his silence had carved itself into their minds. By midnight, Dry Creek settled under the weight of stars, the only sounds the rustle of wind through mesquite and the creak of hitching posts. The saloon grew quiet, the piano long since hushed. In her cabin, Clara prayed, though her prayers had become weary things. She asked not for vengeance, only for the courage to keep walking into town when every step felt like a burden. And on the far edge of town, Elias Boone sat again, this time on the porch of his lonely ranch house. He stared out across the desert, where the moon lit the ridges in silver. His hand rested on an old revolver laid across his lap, the metal worn smooth from use but polished clean, a weapon unseen by the town for years. His jaw tightened, not in anger but in memory. He remembered names, faces, nights filled with smoke and gunfire, the weight of justice carried too far. The quiet rancher had not always been quiet. Dry Creek slept, but its peace was fragile. A widow's limp, a sheriff's corruption, a gang's cruelty, and a rancher's silence, thread stretched thin across the desert's vast emptiness. The wind carried them together, knotting them into a storm unseen. And though no one in town yet knew it, the night Clara limped past Elias Boone, Dry Creek's fate began to turn. The sheriff's office still stood firm under the moonlight, but the wood creaked with every gust, as though it too sensed change coming. In the shadows of that office, Sheriff Harlan smoked another cigar, certain he owned the town. In the shadows of his ranch, Elias Boone prepared himself, certain of nothing but the inevitability of the past returning. The desert had a way of holding on to memories, keeping them beneath its cracked soil and whispering them back in the wind. Clara May knew that truth better than most. Every limp she carried across the dusty streets of Dry Creek was born from that night. The night fire lit her world and bullets chased her across her own doorstep. Her husband, Daniel, had stood in the doorway with his rifle, shouting for her to get the children out. She had tried. She remembered clutching the youngest, shoving the others ahead, when a Tucker's bullet ripped through the boards and found her leg. She remembered the way Daniel fell, the sound of him hitting the floor, and the way the Tucker boys laughed while the flames chewed their home. She had crawled through smoke and ash, dragging herself with a strength she did not believe she had, the children's cries behind her. Daniel never made it. Years had passed, but the limp stayed, as though fate itself wanted her to remember every day what was taken. And the town, Dry Creek with its suspicious eyes and cruel tongues, never let her forget. They saw her weakness, not her survival. They called her cripple, widow, burden. To them, she was less a woman than a ghost of a fire they preferred not to recall. Sheriff Harlan fed that cruelty with a smirk. He had the broad shoulders of a man who once worked for a living but now only leaned against walls and let others bleed for him. His badge gleamed, but it was polished with silver bought from outlaw pockets. When Clara stood before him, desperate, her voice shaking with all the anger she kept buried, he barely listened. He told her justice was a fancy word for those who could pay for it. And when she accused the Tucker gang by name, his smile turned sharp. They keep order in their own way, he said, as if the torching of ranches was some kind of twisted law. What Clara did not know, what most only whispered, was that every cattle raid fattened Harlan's wallet. Each wagon that vanished into the night left a cut for the sheriff. He sat on his porch puffing cigars the gang supplied, liquor on his breath that bore their seal. Men who once trusted the law began turning to silence instead, too afraid or too beaten to resist. Dry Creek Sheriff wasn't a shield. He was a broker, selling the town piece by piece to the highest bidder. Meanwhile, Elias Boone worked his land like the earth itself demanded his devotion. At dawn, Townsfolk sometimes saw him from afar, bent over the fence lines, sweat shining on his brow, a figure made of labor and silence. He spoke to no one, dined alone, and rode into town only when necessity forced it. Mothers pulled their children close when he passed, though he had never raised a hand to anyone. His quietness unsettled them more than violence ever could. For in the West, a man who said nothing was a man who might remember everything. Yet when the Tucker gang's cruelty sharpened, even Elias could not escape notice. One morning, the smoke of another ranch fire rose black against the desert sky. By evening, the story spread. The Tuckers had put torch to the Barton place, running off their cattle and leaving the family with nothing but scorched earth. Sheriff Harlan called it banditry and declared there was no proof. But the town knew better. They could see the gang swaggering through the saloon that night, pockets jingling, boots polished from coin. Clara saw it too. She saw the Bartons packing what little remained onto a wagon, faces hollow with despair. She remembered her own loss, and something inside her broke loose. No longer willing to limp silently, she marched into the street where the Tuckers gathered. With the whole town watching, she raised her voice against them. "You'll not do to another what you did to me," she cried, her voice trembling but loud enough to shake the silence of onlookers. Laughter followed, coarse and mocking. One of the Tucker boys, his teeth yellowed, tipped his hat and called her crippled carriage. Another mimed her limp, stumbling theatrically to the delight of his brothers. But Clara did not retreat. She raised her chin higher, though her leg ached with the effort. She was a woman alone, yet in that moment she stood taller than the men who ridiculed her. The sheriff leaned in the doorway of his office, arms crossed, saying nothing. His eyes flicked to Boone, who stood across the street by his horse. Boone's face gave nothing away, but his gaze lingered on Clara longer than the rest. That night, as the gang jeered and the sheriff smirked, Elias Boone mounted his horse and rode out without a word, dust rising behind him like smoke trailing from an unlit fire. Days later, the Tuckers struck again, this time not with fire but with threats. A merchant who refused to pay them found his windows shattered, his goods stolen. Townsfolk whispered that Clara was next, that her defiance in the street had painted a target on her back. She knew it too, yet she walked into town each day regardless, her limp steady, her face firm. Children followed her with curious eyes, whispering as if she were some spirit conjured to test the town's courage. It was then that old Abel Carter, who had seen more years than most of Dry Creek combined, leaned close to a group of men outside the blacksmith shop and whispered words that made them shudder. "Boone," he said, his voice rough as gravel, "wasn't always Boone. I knew him long ago, when he rode under another name, a name that turned men pale at the mention." The men laughed it off at first, but Abel's eyes were steady and his memory sharp. "They called him the Judge," he muttered. "Fast as draw west of the Pecos. Said he didn't just kill, he passed sentence. Men feared him more than they feared any badge." The rumor slid through Dry Creek like a shadow, curling into corners, settling in whispers at the saloon. If it was true, then the quiet rancher sitting under his hat carried a past far darker than silence suggested. And if it was not true, then why did the Tucker boys flinch each time his gaze brushed across them? That evening, Clara lit the lantern in her cabin and looked at her children, who clung to her skirts with wide eyes. Fear had followed them for years, but now it stalked openly. She kissed each forehead and told them to sleep, though she herself could not. Her limp ached more than usual, the old one throbbing in the night's chill. Yet in her heart there burned something hotter than fear, something that told her the Tuckers would not win forever. Out in the desert, Elias Boone sat with his revolver on the table beside him. The moon shone pale against the steel. He stared at it for a long time, his jaw clenched, his silence a prison of his own making. Somewhere in the wind, the name he had buried returned like a whisper, the Judge. He closed his eyes, knowing the past was stirring again, whether he wished it or not. The night fell heavy over Dry Creek, thick with heat that refused to leave even when the sun had gone. Lanterns flickered in windows, shadows stretched long over the dust, and every soul in town seemed to sense the storm rolling closer. Somewhere beyond the horizon, hooves pounded, the kind of rhythm that told even the half-asleep dogs to whimper low. Clara May had finished her chores and walked into town, her limp dragging against the dirt road, each step an act of defiance against the memory of fire and smoke. She knew the whispers, that the Tuckers would come for her after she raised her voice in the street, but she would not hide. Her children needed to see courage, not fear. And so she pressed forward, lantern-light glinting off her determined face, while the silence of the town followed her like a procession. Inside the Red Lantern Saloon, the piano had stilled, the gamblers' hands frozen over cards. Men and women pressed themselves against the shutters, watching the street. Boots clattered faintly, spurs chiming, laughter harsh and rising in the distance. The Tucker gang was coming. The very air seemed to dry up, leaving throats parched, eyes wide. Sheriff Harlan stood on his porch, lighting another cigar, his smirk cutting through the tension. He knew what was about to happen. He had been warned, paid, prepared. His badge caught the lamplight, but no one mistook it for justice. He folded his arms and waited for the gang to arrive, his shadow stretching long across the street. The first rider burst into town, horse-lathered and wild-eyed, dust exploding around its hooves. Then came the others, 6 men in dark hats, their guns gleaming even in the weak light. At their center rode Jack Tucker, broad as an ox, his face marked by a scar that ran from ear to jaw. His voice carried like a whip as he called, "Where's that limping witch? Where's the woman who thinks she can spit on Tucker business?" Clara froze only a moment. She stood there in the middle of the street, framed by lanterns, her figure thin but unyielding. Her limp slowed her but did not stop her as she turned to face them. The gang dismounted, boots slamming into the dirt, laughter shaking loose from their throats like broken glass. The townsfolk shrank deeper into the shadows, unwilling to move. And then, from the porch across the street, Elias Boone rose. Slowly, deliberately, as though every second were measured against eternity. He pushed back his chair. The sound of wood scraping against the boards was louder than the gang's mockery. He straightened to his full height, shoulders broad beneath his dust-worn coat, his hat low, his silence unshaken. The gang stilled for a heartbeat, their laughter faltering as Boone stepped down into the street. Dust puffed at his boots, and the town held its breath. The wind shifted, rattling the shutters, carrying the smell of horses and sweat and the faint smoke of the Bartons' burned ranch still lingering in the air. Jack Tucker sneered. "Well, look here." The mute rancher finally crawls out from his corner. "Gonna say something, old man? Or just stand there like a scarecrow?" Boone did not speak. He kept walking until he stood in the open space between Clara and the gang, his presence a wall no one had expected. His hand brushed against his coat, not reaching, just resting near the shape of the revolver hidden there. Clara's heart thundered, though her face did not show it. She stepped closer, putting herself at Boone's side, her limp forcing her to sway but never to falter. "You'll not lay a hand on me," she said, her voice steady as stone. The gang laughed again, but the laughter was brittle. The silence of the rancher pressed in on them, unsettling as a riddle with no answer. Jack Tucker spat into the dirt. "I'll carve that limp right out of you, woman. And as for him," he gestured toward Boone, his grin wide, "he's nothing but a ghost who forgot how to haunt." The wind carried a dry rattle of leaves. A dog barked once, then went silent. Somewhere a shutter banged, echoing like a gunshot. And in that moment, the town realized no one was breathing. Boone's eyes lifted, and the moonlight caught them, pale fire burning within. He finally spoke, his voice low, worn by years but sharp enough to cut. "You've had your time, Tucker." It was the first word anyone had heard him utter in years. Whispers ran like electricity through the onlookers. Clara felt the weight of it, the change in the air, the shift of the earth itself. Jack Tucker's hand went for his pistol. Fast, sure, arrogant. But Boone was faster. The draw was silent lightning, the flash of steel too quick for the eye to follow. By the time Tucker's gun cleared leather, Boone's shot had already cracked the night. The bullet struck true, tearing into Tucker's chest, and the outlaw staggered backward, disbelief etched across his scarred face before he crumpled to the dirt. The gang erupted, hands flying for their weapons. Clara, heart hammering, did the only thing she could. She screamed. A sharp, piercing cry that startled the horses and made 2 of the gang glance her way. That heartbeat of distraction was all Boone needed. His revolver sang again, and 2 more men dropped before their triggers could be pulled. The others hesitated, shaken by the speed, by the precision, by the ghost they had awakened. Boone's stance was steady, his revolver an extension of his will, his silence heavier than the thunder of his shots. The remaining outlaws backed toward their horses, fear unraveling their bravado. You're him," one stammered, his face pale in the lantern light. "You're the judge." The name fell into the dirt like a curse, and the town recoiled. Stories long buried clawed their way back. The judge, legend of the borderlands, the gunman who dealt death as though passing sentence, who vanished years ago after swearing never to kill again. Manette said he was dead, or gone to Mexico, or buried under another name. But here he was, standing in Dry Creek with justice burning in his hand. Clara turned her gaze to him, her breath trembling in her chest. She saw not a killer but a man who carried the weight of every shot, who had buried his past under silence until the world forced his hand again. His stillness was no longer mystery. It was penance. The last Tucker boy bolted for his horse, firing wild over his shoulder, but Boone's shot clipped the gun clean from his hand. The weapon spun into the dirt, and the boy froze, eyes wide, before fleeing into the darkness. The gang was broken, scattered like dust before the wind. Sheriff Harlan's cigar dropped from his mouth, his hand shaking as he stepped back into the shadows of his office. He had wagered on the Tuckers, but the table had been overturned in one heartbeat of thunder. The town's eyes turned not to him but to Boone, who stood tall in the street, revolver smoking, his silence louder than any law. Clara reached for Boone's arm, steadying herself on her bad leg. Her voice was soft, meant for him alone. "You didn't kill tonight. You saved." For the first time, Boone's jaw eased, the hard line of his mouth loosening. He holstered his revolver, the motion final, as though sealing the judge back into the shadows. He glanced once toward Clara, his eyes heavy with unspoken words, then turned his gaze to the sheriff's office. The night was quiet again, save for the hiss of the wind through the mesquite. Dry Creek had held its breath, and now it exhaled as though waking from a nightmare. But the town knew, deep down, nothing would ever be the same. The judge had risen from silence, and justice, however fleeting, had walked its streets once more. The dust of the gunfight still hung in the air when the last echo of gunfire faded into silence. The street smelled of smoke and fear, of sweat and gun oil. Jack Tucker's body lay sprawled in the dirt, his eyes wide open but empty of menace, and his men had scattered like coyotes chased from a carcass. For the first time in years, Dry Creek was quiet, not the fearful quiet of submission, but the stunned silence that comes when something impossible has happened before one's eyes. Sheriff Harlan stumbled back into the glow of his doorway, his cigar gone, his face pale and wet with sweat. He stammered words that no one cared to hear. He shot in cold blood. Harlan tried, his voice breaking. "This ain't law, this is murder." But the townsfolk, who moments ago had hidden behind shutters and barrels, began to step into the street. They had seen the truth. They had seen who the murderers were and who had stopped them. It was Clara who broke the stillness. She stepped forward on her bad leg, her limp steady and proud, her eyes locked on Harlan's. "Murder?" she asked, her voice carrying louder than it had ever been allowed to before. "What about Daniel May? What about the Bardens? What about every ranch you sold for whiskey and silver? You call that law?" The people shifted, murmuring. The blacksmith's hammer-calloused hand clenched into a fist. Mrs. Barden, her dress still ash-stained, stepped out with her children beside her. More voices rose, accusations long buried, resentments silenced by fear, now spilling out into the open. Harlan's smirk was gone. His badge, once a shield, gleamed now like a stain. He cursed under his breath and reached for his gun, but before the metal could clear his belt, a dozen townsfolk surged forward. Hands grabbed him, tore the weapon away, dragged him into the dirt. He shouted, threatened, begged, but the tide of anger was stronger than him. By the time they shoved him into the jail he had once ruled, the sheriff of Dry Creek was no more than a man stripped of power, a man trembling before the people he had betrayed. Clara stood in the street, lantern light flickering against her face. For years she had carried the weight of her limp as if it were a sentence, a reminder that she was broken. Now, under the eyes of the town, it became proof that she had endured what others could not. No one laughed at her anymore. No one mocked the way she walked. They saw her as the woman who defied the Tuckers, who spoke when no one else dared, who stood beside the quiet rancher when justice finally came to Dry Creek. Children watched her with wide eyes, whispering her name not as an insult but as something close to reverence. Men tipped their hats. Women touched her hand as the past, as if some strength might pass into them. In one night, Clara May had become the voice of courage for a town that had forgotten what courage was. Elias Boone stood apart, his revolver holstered once more, his silence heavy but changed. No longer was it the silence of shame. It was the silence of a man who had borne judgment and found, at last, a measure of redemption. The judge had returned, but not to kill endlessly, only to remind a broken town that justice did not always wear a star on its chest. As dawn crept over the desert, painting the sky in soft streaks of gold and rose, Boone saddled his horse. He moved with the same quiet deliberation he always had, but those who watched him knew they would never see him the same way again. Clara approached, her limp steady, her eyes clear. She did not try to stop him. She only said, "Thank you." He tipped his hat, the faintest trace of something like respect flickering across his face. Then, without a word, he mounted and turned his horse toward the open desert. The hooves beat a rhythm into the earth, fading with each stride, until he was only a dark shape swallowed by the horizon. Clara remained where she stood, the first rays of sunlight warming her shoulders. Around her, the townsfolk gathered, their voices hushed, their eyes lifted. She was no longer the widow mocked for her limp. She was a testament, a living reminder that survival could turn into strength, and strength into change. They say the sheriff's office still trembles when the wind rattles its windows, for it remembers the night a limping widow and a quiet rancher rewrote the law of the frontier. And long after the dust settled, Dry Creek carried the legend, not of the sheriff, not of the gang, but of the woman who would not bow and the men who stood when it mattered most.